Welcome to episode 17 of Dear Nina, Conversations About Friendship. Today's show is about sobriety, from addiction to all levels of sober living, and how friendships transition and sometimes completely phase out in early sobriety, how friendships can factor into addiction and to what can happen after when you're in recovery, and just what all of that looks like. My guest today is Jen Gilhoi. Jen is an event experience strategist and founder of Sparktrack. In her life and work, she is fascinated with the art of gathering and intentional conversations. In 2014, she moved on from active addiction and began a sober lifestyle. As an introvert and moderate empath, she's discovered that the written word is her avenue to invite others into inquiry and shatter stigmas around addiction. To further that passion, she's a board member of Dissonance, an organization that promotes mental health and recovery in and through the arts. She also shares her experiences in blog and short story format on her website, which I will link to in the show notes, of course. Hi, Jen, and welcome, and thank you so much for sharing your story with us.
Hi, Nina. So happy to be here, and it's been a joy to follow you in all your friendship conversations since you started your podcast.
Jen and I both office out of Modern Well in Minneapolis, a co-working space, and we don't know each other that well, but I would say we've always been the mutual admirers from lots of waves and highs, and it's like one of those people, and this is, probably a friendship discussion for another time, is how you get from years of just saying hi and, admiring each other's work and different things you're doing. That could go on for 3 decades. And there's place for that too. Not everything has to translate into, girls' trips. But I just want to say to you.
That would be fun.
Wouldn't that be fun? But I've always been interested in the work you do. And I was so happy to know that you're comfortable talking about this topic. It is such a good topic and an important one, and really different from a lot of the episodes that I have done. And addiction and sober living is something that absolutely is a piece of the friendship puzzle that needs to be discussed. And you are so generous in talking about your story and lessons people can learn. Why don't we start with, before we even get to the friendship piece, just for our listeners, because I know some of your story, and I know it's also impossible to discuss an entire story of addiction and history of, getting sober and recovering in a couple minutes. But can you give us a little bit of what you're comfortable with sharing, just for context to start?
Sure. Yeah, like you had said, my addiction spans 2 decades, which is kind of unbelievable. And I believe it's an ongoing thing that I manage. So it never really goes away. In recovery, it is still part of who I am. So my identity is really wrapped up in this sometimes label of alcoholism. But there are terms like alcohol use disorder, and now coming to it and looking back on my story, I see how all of that ebbs and flows. So really, I started in my late teens in high school, had my first drink in a social situation, didn't particularly care for the taste of it, but absolutely loved the way it made me feel. And throughout high school and into college, being surrounded in social scenes where drinking was always the kind of core of the gathering, I learned, and it becomes a learned behavior, that alcohol is lubrication for, a social good time. And I also was incredibly shy. And so I was under the assumption that I needed alcohol in order to socialize. So that continued through college, throughout my career, and obviously, the stakes got higher in terms of responsibility and how I needed to show up. So somehow I managed to show up for work. I was very passionate and dedicated in my careers in marketing communications, and held one job for 10 years. And it's amazing to me that I somehow thought I managed that all very well. And that's what we'll also touch on, is that alcohol is cunning and baffling, and it's very powerful. And it's hard to know when you're not an alcoholic. People want to put labels to that. So my story is that I was in a very I guess, challenging place around age 40 where workplace stress was at a height for me. And I spiraled into more of an addiction than ever. So it progressed very quickly around age 40. And that's when I was able to have my husband intervene, have others around me help me seek help. So that started around age 40, became completely sober around age 42, and I do have 7+ years of sobriety that I am extremely grateful for.
Congratulations on that. And actually, I'm going to quickly jump in with one of the questions we got because this is a perfect time to say it. One question I got, I put in my Facebook group. I have a private Facebook group. I mean, private meaning anyone can join it, but it's not the topics within aren't visible unless you're in it, just called Dear Nina, the group. And I put that we were covering this topic and if any questions people had. And one of the first questions I got was asking, do people want to be congratulated? What do you say to someone when they say, I have, 5 years, 1 year, 10 years? And do they want their friends to acknowledge these anniversaries? I mean, of course you cannot speak for all people, but let me just ask you, do you like when friends acknowledge that?
Absolutely. I think it's the beginning of creating a conversation. And that to me is an open door to ask questions and have that kind of language form. And I notice if, people, if I posted on my Facebook that I'm celebrating 7 years, the comments, I think one woman said it really well in sobriety. She's like, I'm not posting this for purposes of congrats and like pat on the back, but it is so that my sharing my story can help others. So there's all sorts of avenues to that. I love when people acknowledge that and just share that they're happy for me.
And would you want friends to acknowledge it without you needing to prompt it? Is it something like, do you have any close friends who keep track, like they would a birthday or they would, like ahead of you posting?
Oh my gosh, Nina, I would love that. And honestly, it doesn't really happen. I love it when people say, I see you, I see your work, I see what you're doing. And sometimes I'll get an occasional text from a friend just on something sobriety related that I've posted. But yeah, I love it when it's unprompted and someone goes out of their way. I did have a friend, one dear friend, who sent me a card on a sober anniversary, my 5 year, and it was before the date, and she remembered. And that meant so much to me.
So that's a great answer, like for you, and for your friends who are listening. But I'm sure
Yeah.
there's people have others in their lives who maybe would appreciate a gesture like that. But I skipped way ahead to questions, and I'll backtrack now to you had told me that you listened to the podcast, and it really made you think about that you've talked about your story. You've talked about your story before, and it's this isn't like the first time you've spoken publicly about it, but you hadn't really thought about it from a friendship angle. So what were some of the things that, before I even get to all the other questions, we got some great ones that just like came up for you as you were listening to episodes and just thinking about your life?
Yeah, I was thinking about a sadness early on in sobriety where I was faced with the idea that certain friends who, when I got together with, alcohol was always the center of everything. I was faced with the, I guess, challenge of just letting those go in order to maintain my sobriety. So I started thinking about how it was a sad kind of feeling in the beginning of sobriety, and then started thinking about how eventually I started to make friends that really connected with my interests on a personal level. And so I began to wonder, was alcohol the only reason I was with these particular friends? Which is a question for everyone. And then how it has evolved. And I would say about 3, 4 years into my sobriety, I started really connecting with others who were like minded in terms of the things they'd like to do outside of going to bars and restaurants. So it might have been yoga or sauna, things like that. And then the friendships that form from that feel so much more deep and connected than earlier friendships that seem maybe a little superficial or maybe more centered around alcohol.
Yeah, I could see how that would be, and especially when you shared your specific story of feeling that the alcohol helped you socialize in those early years. It would be so hard to unpair that. I'm sure that was a massive amount of work, like to unpair, I'm a fun, outgoing person. And so then to still know that you are this fun, great person to be with. Did friends, did you keep any friends from before?
I've circled back to those friendships over the last couple years, and they mean something different, and they definitely they look different. They're not as close. They're deep because a lot of them go all the way back to college, but they're not. They just have changed, and I've had to be okay with that. I think that's another thing I was thinking about, Nina, coming on this podcast is how would I even begin to categorize what the value or what that is? And because of your previous podcasts I've listened to, I've been thinking about it's okay to like let some of those transitions happen and just be at peace with it. And it really is what it is.
Yeah, that's a good answer. And I know it's like different for every person. And so are you able to maintain friendships with newer friends, like people you're meeting, let's say through work or different other way, at Modern Well or anywhere, and somehow alcohol enters the picture, as it just does in our society? It's gotten worse, I'd say. I mean, visibly from a marketing standpoint.
Yep. So there's mommy wine culture.
Yes,
There's
yes.
wine and wellness events, and you see it all on social media. And in the past, my early sobriety, it was awkward and uncomfortable and frankly just irritating as all get out to see that in my face everywhere. Now, with 7 years of sobriety, I've transitioned and understanding that it is my role and I can be that person to help others by calling out these things that are happening. So, for example, I was invited to an Italian wine event, and I love Italy. And I used to love the wines. I studied in Rome, and rather than just RSVPing no, I just reached out and I said, "This looks like an awesome event. Maybe to be more inclusive, you could have it be about Italian culture. And one option is the wine tasting, the other is the tiramisu. Like, there's so many ways to bring awareness. And I think that's a space that I'm very grateful to be in, but also realize that not enough people are speaking out or know how to speak out because it is very frustrating in early sobriety to encounter these things everywhere you go, in the workplace, at events, in your inbox, on Instagram. It's absolute overload. So, talking about what things you need to do away with in early sobriety, social media, some friendships, it's just part of the process of maintaining that absolute fierce vigilance around your sobriety at all costs. Not fun, but that's the way it typically works.
That makes sense. Do you think that there are friends who are self-conscious about their drinking in front of you? Not because of what you might think, not because like they're worried you're going to pick up a drink, but like, are they asked, do you have people come to you and say, well, I have a drink every night? Somebody sent a question to me to ask you, really. And I wonder if you get these kinds of questions from friends. I'll just use it now as the example. This listener wrote that she has to drink a drink every single night when she cooks. And she doesn't really want to cook without the drink. It's sort of like they're paired. I used the word pairing earlier, like pairing with these friends or pairing alcohol with the ability to like go out and be social. In her case, it's not a social thing. It's actually a totally not social thing, but it has the pairing of the routine of cooking. And like, so she wants to know, like, is this a problem? Do you get that question? Is this a problem?
Yes, I get it all the time. And I often will talk about in early sobriety when I was asking myself that same question. I would maybe, even 20 years ago when I knew, I'd go online and take a test. Are you an alcoholic? And oh, I answered only 7 of them. I must not be. So I think everyone wants to know the answer to that question. And one of the biggest things I've landed on is recognizing if your activities are planned around alcohol and recognizing the habits that you start to form because alcoholism is a progressive disease. So once you start using it as a coping or you pair it, I think that's brilliant wording. You pair it with certain activities, it begins to become ingrained and inseparable. So for those people, like that's a perfect example. So when you notice things like that, to be able to say, tonight I am, and tell others, tell your husband, whomever, I am going to, make dinner and not have that glass of wine. And you have to actually take intentional vocal steps to let people around you know what you're doing if you really want to hold yourself accountable. Like all those tips and tricks are in my sleeve, up my sleeve. But try doing the cooking, without it. Try, experimenting. And then the other books right now that are so popular by women in recovery are talking about replacing those things with something else that's healthier. So you might cook and you might be doing, something, listening to music, listening to a podcast, or doing something else that kind of replaces that habit that you've normally paired with alcohol. And then and that's my whole journey here is about inquiry. So that's exactly where it starts.
That's such great advice. And I know that you really have been helping other people. Let's actually talk about that for a moment, like in the work you're doing, because you are in events and that is a hard space to unpair, as to say again, from alcohol. But I know you're really working hard on that. Tell us a little bit about, your website and your work and ways you're helping others, and then we'll get to our other questions.
Yeah, I think awareness, number one. So, thinking about alcoholics and how in recovery they come together in AA communities. And this is a whole nother friendship conversation, but many of them tend to only be friends with others in AA. Those conversations and things can happen within the rooms, but my work is to take more of that experience into the public and let people know. Because how do restaurant owners and event owners make change if there aren't people speaking up that they want that change? And I have found that many are open to it. They just don't understand, not only just to offer, for example, at restaurants, non alcoholic options and put them on the menu, but think about the actual experience where your wait staff understands that not everyone wants a drink. They're not pushing happy hour specials. They use a different language. I can't tell you the number of times, and my work gets into this over the last 7 years, where I've had terrible experiences trying to order a non alcoholic beverage, trying to be in a celebratory mode, and then just being made to feel less than or unincluded. And it happens all the time still. So there's definitely work to be done in this space, and with 10 plus years of event experience, I hope to make some impact there.
That's all such good tips. I wish like every event person or restaurant owner, like if it's you're right, it does get pushed. It's such a huge part of just every day. I want to pick back up on something you had mentioned about sometimes people in AA, having these really comfortable conversations with people within the group and then maybe becoming, I don't know if you said this or really implied it, becoming dependent on people on the same exact path for friendship. It makes a lot of sense in those early years of recovery. But how does somebody transition to having friends who aren't, like, that's not the only thing they have in common? Because just like you could have friends that you do a lot of like drinking with, and then you kind of look up and go, do we have anything else in common? I imagine that the opposite is true, that you could have friends who are on a similar path of sobriety, and you kind of go, well, do we have other values and things in common other than the fact that we are all staying away from alcohol?
Yes, all really great, a great topic to dive into. So, AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, is one of the main ways people first get help and find some sort of community. So I think when many come to AA, and it's just this immediate bonding that feels friendship like, because it's the first time you've like shared this experience and you bond incredibly quickly. Like you could look at, the man next to you is, 65 plus and has 30 years of sobriety, and you're on your first day, yet you feel this incredible connection. So that's undeniable. And I think that's how a lot of it starts in early sobriety. I would say I was a little more reserved, and I like to make small intentional friendships. So I would seek out, I had maybe 3 close friends that first year, including my sponsor. And it's just a different style. Others take those AA groups and then they go on to some social hour after. So deep-seated friendships can be, created. I wanted something a little different, and what I felt was more like what we call in AA, we call the normal drinkers normies. So I wanted to blend. My goal was to maintain sobriety, but then, touch back and enrich those friendships that I had before that were worth saving or worth exploring, and have a balanced friendship or group of friends, I should say. So I've noticed that it is very distinct. There's certain people in AA they just hold that family and community very close as friends via friend group.
I think that we'll go straight to our questions, Jen, because they're good questions, and I know you have a lot to share, and hopefully some of that will just come out with the questions. So the question was, I still think it's worth repeating. The question is, are your friendships compartmentalized, sober life friends and others? And you just really answered that you try to have a balance in your life. Do you mix friends together? I know there is this piece of anonymity. And even like you being on this podcast and talking about AA, like, is that okay with like being anonymous? Like, how does that work? Because I wondered about that.
I think in early sobriety, I would say, well, for sure the first year, I wasn't having conversations with anyone I didn't know how to say anything in a social situation. And if you look back on some of my posts where I write about it, is literally I stayed home for a year. That's how devastating it was to like be in those situations. And I did want to remain anonymous. I didn't want to be like, I'm in recovery. The language was not there for me. It felt like, again, that label of alcoholic comes with so much baggage, so much shame. I was not ready to take that on. So I think the anonymity for me changed around year 3 when I had started having individual conversations with people and building my confidence in here's what to say. Here's what to say when someone offers you a water in a styrofoam sippy cup and everyone else has fancy glasses. Here's, all those situations I had enough confidence in. So I became comfortable mixing, normies and sober friends and all of that. But it took 3 years or more.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you for sharing that. This question is, while the sober individual has come through trauma, those who support someone through addiction and recovery also experience pain. And so factoring that in, like, what was that healing process like to sustain friendships where, you maybe hurt someone or damage to the relationship because of the addiction?
Oh, that is such a great question. And I would say that there's probably not enough support in society for, those dealing with trauma from a loved one experiencing or going through recovery. One of the biggest things through AA is the step of making amends. So what I learned and what my sponsor coached me through is to look at all of my relationships, including the one with my husband, the one with friends, and being able to I actually wrote out what I thought the impact of my alcohol use was on our relationship, and went to, family, went to friends, and explained kind of, this is how I see my part in this. And so it's called a living amends. And I think it's making amends. And then the other piece of that is living amends, which is showing up, doing the things that show your friend, whoever you're in a relationship with, those that have experienced trauma, that you are making your changes. And that's all you can do. So it does create a way to make this a conversation. Otherwise, I think, the person who's in trauma over here is like, oh, great, they're getting help. But where does that leave me? How do I deal with my anger, my resentment for my husband, 20 years of instability in some situations and unknowing. So it brings up a lot of things. And again, it's, as a culture, there aren't a lot of places to always have those healthy conversations. And a lot of those relationships just fall by the wayside, but they're worth to the person in recovery and the person who has experienced trauma, they are worth a healthy conversation around everything that had happened.
Yeah, and then this is where forgiveness comes in. I've done whole episodes about that. I mean, forgiveness, self-forgiveness, and then people can be forgiving, hopefully, and be forgiven.
Yeah.
Was anyone surprised, like when you came to make this list and have people you wanted to get in touch with, did anyone say like, oh, I didn't even know that you were struggling with this? Or did most people say, oh, I'm glad you're on this path now. Did people know? I guess I'm asking.
No, they said they did not. Other than,
Interesting.
I know, it's fascinating to me. And that's a couple things. That is what I would call, and probably many, maybe women, men, in career, in corporate America, high functioning alcoholics. So we are so good showing up for our day job. So, with all the different gray areas of drinking, I was not drinking at work. I work out. I do all the things that would look to any outsider like I've got my life together, but drinking was still a problem. So another message is, drinking can still be a problem even if you're only drinking 3 hours a night. Even if you're only, so I think I want people to know that as well, because on the outside it looked like I was all put together, and that also prevented from other people stepping in to help, because they might have seen signs of it. They might have been like, "Ooh, she seemed at that event maybe to have a bit, more cocktails than the rest of us," but they file it away. It's just like, okay, that's an outlier kind of experience of what I know of Jen. So it's fascinating that so many people, in fact, one of my close friends that I used to drink a lot with was like, "You are not. You're just fine." And, things like that were just kind of fascinating to me. I'm like, no, I have decided this is how I view my drinking, and it's not healthy. So you have to respect an individual when they say that, but also fascinating that not a lot of people either see it or recognize it in others.
Right. Or want to see it. I think the
Or want,
example,
yes.
yeah, that example you just gave of your friend would explain why some friendships, I don't know what happened with this friendship, but in general, I could see why some friendships might just not make it, because it happens when people change their eating habits and stuff too, right? Like there's these things we do as groups, and if one person breaks off, it does call into question. People don't like to be questioned, even if you're not asking the question or posing the question to anyone else. It's just about your own journey. I think others take it as a statement on their habits, perhaps. And so some aren't ready to think of it.
So insightful. And I think it also begs the question in this particular case of asking yourself then, what are my drinking habits like? And that's another, on my website, I've talked about supporting a spouse in sobriety, and many spouses don't want to call out their partner's drinking problem or what they're seeing, because it means that they themselves would have to look at theirs. And even if they're having a glass of wine a day, which may be normal and feel normal, that is going to come back to them to question about themselves. So it puts a huge burden on people in your life and society to be able to call that out. And that's why it's so important to internally ask yourself these questions, look at, society and some of the cues, and be able to define for yourself what a drinking problem feels like to you.
Yeah, I definitely get the sense there isn't one right answer. What
Mm-hmm.
is the best thing anyone can do to support a friend who's like, let's use your story, for example. You, like, 7 years ago, you made this change, and I know you said like for a year you didn't really go out, and I actually heard you say in one other interview that it took you a long time to go to AA because you didn't want, and I think this is probably very common, to have to say those words, "I'm an alcoholic," right? That's it. But once you went and you had your year and you were home and you were kind of ready to be out again, what was the best thing friends did to support you? And what could people do to support others?
The best thing that a friend in particular did, and friends can do, is to suggest things that don't involve alcohol. So I had a text string of friends that we would do happy hour together, and I would get that, and I would just feel like, like a weight of like having to be in that situation. Whereas one friend was like, "Hey, do you want to grab a coffee? Do you want to do yoga? Do you want to go to a movie?" There's all of these other things in society that don't revolve around alcohol, and I was just so relieved that she didn't even say, "Hey, do you want to do something?" It was like, "Let's get coffee." It set the stage for, she knew where I was at. She knew I didn't want to be in those situations, and she just intuitively would invite me to things that I didn't have to put myself in those situations.
That would be such a perfect thing a friend can do to help.
Yeah.
Exactly. Like just to let you not even have to face the situation and to maintain that friendship and hang out. You can see how for teenagers, I have teenagers, I know you do too. Once they get into that stuff and that's like what the friend group is doing, like very quickly, it happens quickly. Like they can't think of what else is there to do. They can't, you could see how kids I mean, I remember, being a teenager, like if you start on that path, it is very hard to think of other things. Part of the fun is acquiring and then using, and that goes for drugs too, obviously. I mean, it's not just, it's another huge part of culture is um all that, but I'm not even gonna get into that. That's like a whole different topic. What are some things that were not helpful that just frankly made you feel bad or didn't help in any way?
Yeah, I think, friends that were trying to navigate, those situations with me during early sobriety were a challenge because they didn't know what to do for me. And I think there was one instance where this person continued to ask me, can I get you something to drink? And there's soda, there's water, and I just totally wanted to fade into the background. Like I just wanted to have my water in my hand or whatever it was, and not be continually kind of called out as not drinking. And I just was like, can we just let it go? Can we not acknowledge it? So I think there's just some awkwardness in those situations where I just would love someone to have my back and step in for me. Like even my husband will be like, she's not drinking tonight. Like other people that can like just cover you so you don't have to be in those situations that happen all the time.
Oh, I'm glad you said that. I think that will help people who are listening. I think a nice balance to these two questions and the answers are like if you're hosting a dinner, you're hosting an event, it's nice to make sure there are other things available, but you also don't need to push it on anybody. Like,
Hmm.
right? Have other things besides alcohol around, but you do not need to single out the person is not drinking and be like, just so you know, we have other,
Yes,
like have the stuff,
exactly.
right? Have it available, but you don't
Yes.
need to like make a big deal about it.
I love that. Yes. Have it in the background. Have it just be, even for, again, back to our conversation about wait staff, it's like, don't make me ask what non alcoholic cocktails you have. Either have it on the menu or just make it obvious. I can't tell you how many restaurants don't even have it on the menu. So starting there, having someone else even ask the wait staff, or I sometimes do research in advance to find out if that restaurant or bar I'm going to has good options. Do they have things available? And that always helps as well, kind of planning how that experience is going to go. And maybe you have a buddy or a friend that you kind of are like, go into it with and they have your back. That always feels good.
That's a great answer. I think we'll wrap things up soon because like this we could just talk about this for a long time. But is there anything else you would like people to know? People who are listening, who have friends who might be struggling, haven't been on a path yet of sobriety, or they are like just other anything we didn't cover that's glaring.
Yeah, I feel like the biggest thing is, again, my space that I'm in is conversations around this. And the more conversations we have, I am, maybe I'm at a point in more of sobriety, but I feel like, asking someone how they are and acknowledging that they're on a recovery journey is a huge first step. And a lot of times, because people ask me, can we not talk about this? But just recognizing that, in sobriety too, people will ask questions that can be very painful and come from a place where they just don't understand at all. So the more you go through, sobriety and have those conversations with friends, it's an opportunity to talk with them, tell them what you need. Don't close those people off. Oftentimes, they want to understand and help, they just don't know where to begin.
It's really, really helpful. And I just appreciate your time and your openness. People can find more of your work. Why don't you tell them exactly where and then we'll close out?
Yeah, so you can find my work on sobriety and a wellness journey on jengilhoi.com. And what I'm doing is really writing about, just like this, Nina. You've got questions from writers. I love or people writing in, an audience that wants to know. And that's where I'm getting the content. What am I going to write next? So chime in, ask me a question there. I do have an e-news where I'm putting out some of the conversation and commentary. The most important thing I will say, though, is that the space that I'm in, and I would encourage anyone considering, sobriety or dry January to be in, is the space of inquiry around society as well. So it's a very shameful thing, traditionally, like just over our culture, to look at your drinking as your own burden. But when you start to look at how much society has contributed to that, the weight placed on yourself can be lifted a bit, and you can see that it's not all on you, it's not all your shame, and you can start taking the next steps to find help, which is what we all need right now. So, yeah, thanks, Nina.
No, thank you. It's a beautiful and hopeful place to end. So we will end it right there. I will remind people that they can find the show notes and a place to ask anonymous questions and leave voicemails at ninabadzin.com. And I hope that if you enjoyed this episode or any episode, you will rate and review the show. And really, the best thing is to share it with friends. And thanks to my producer, Dave DeLuger. We will see you in a few weeks. Thanks.